Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this event here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Shaman. I'm the interim dean of the Climate School. It's a pleasure to be here and see so many of you coming out to see what we're up to. So thank you for participating. The meeting that we're having here today is various formats that are intended to highlight the importance of this year's COP outcomes. That's the Conference of the Parties, number 29, that was held in Baku, Azerbaijan last month. Specifically, we're going to hear about the implications for global climate policy, some of the opportunities and challenges associated with the new climate finance deal that was struck in Baku. This was a new collective quantified goal of $300 billion a year by 2035. The implications of the U.S. elections for global climate policy may come up, and discuss also the growing urgency of clean energy transitions amidst the escalating climate inaction. So I represent the Climate School, so it's my job to pump it up a little bit and tell you a little bit about it. Not all of you are from it or associated with it, but for us, we hold an important role, we feel, as a convener of critical dialogues on global climate politics. In doing so, we're trying to support rigorous interaction and interrogation on the issues, the development of evidence-based solutions, and really provide opportunities for student engagements. The importance of this is that at COP, there were a number of political and economic tensions that had to be navigated. It was very clear there. It was very clear in the aftermath. Climate equity, in particular, for the world's most vulnerable communities, was really on the agenda and in the air. And once again, it held place during the negotiations and in many of the comments I think some of you saw after the negotiations. So today, we're going to have an interdisciplinary conversation about COP, the challenges ahead, and the pathways for crafting actionable solutions. We have 5 speaker panelists today. Lisa Sachs, over here on my right, your left, is director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. This is a joint center of the Columbia Climate School and the Columbia Law School. She studies how law, policy, and business shape global investment and sustainable development, and she works with governments, development organizations, financial institutions, and other sectors to support investment practices that promote the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. And starting January 1, she will be an associate professor of professional practice in the Climate School, and we're greatly looking forward to that. Jeffrey Sachs, who will be joining us shortly, is a university professor and the Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development in the School of International and Public Affairs, as well as a professor of health policy and management at the Mailman School of Public Health. He was the director of the Earth Institute from 2002 to 2016, and he also was the special advisor to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at the time on Sustainable Development Goals. He has worked to end poverty, overcome macroeconomic instability, promote economic growth, fight hunger and disease, and promote sustainable environmental practices. Lisa Dale, on my far left, your far right here, is a lecturer in climate and the director of the Climate School's Master of Arts in Climate and Society program. I suspect some of you are in that program here. She's trained as a political scientist and teaches and studies climate change adaptation and environmental policy. Field projects of hers include working with agricultural communities in sub-Saharan Africa and assessing wildlife risk zones in the American West. Gernot Wagner, here, the only male up here other than me, is a senior lecturer in economics at the Columbia Business School and the faculty director for the Climate Knowledge Institute at the Tamer Institute for Social Enterprise and Climate Change, which is also housed at the Columbia Business School. His research and teaching foci are climate risks and policy, as these pertain to an array of topics, and those include the social costs of carbon, renewable energy deployment, and economic damage. Lastly, but certainly not least, Amy Campbell is a student in our MA in Climate and Society program, and she's focusing on climate disaster preparedness. She is working with the Rockefeller Foundation and the National Center for Disaster Preparedness to improve understanding and metrics of vulnerability. She is a UNFCCC, and for those of you who don't know, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiator on behalf of the United Kingdom, in which she works to build capacity and develop international climate policy. So she has direct experience working in the COP field. All right, so lastly, I just want to frame this a little bit. Some of our objectives here are to explore the key takeaways from COP29, to bridge academic insights with real-world negotiations and implementation. And we're going to start with a couple presentations. Lisa Dale and Lisa Sachs are going to give some presentations. Then we're then going to move to a panel discussion where all 5 people will be up here. It will be moderated by Lisa Dale. Yes, got 2 Lisas on the other side, so I'm going to make sure which one I'm going to. Then Jeff Sachs will give a talk, and then Lisa Sachs will moderate Q&A and give some closing remarks. So I hope you enjoy this. Welcome. Anybody comes in, please sit down. And I'm going to turn over to Lisa Dale.
Nope, Lisa Sachs. Me.
I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Sachs.
Thank you so much. And nothing makes me happier than the climate school and the law school being in the same room. So, so really thrilled and grateful to the climate school for organizing this discussion. So I had the privilege with Lisa and Jeff Sachs also to be at this year's COP. I know there was a session before the COP that went a bit more over the COP process, but in case there are some of you that weren't there, I just want to very briefly explain the distinction between the formal outcomes, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the experience that we had, because we were not in the formal room, we were not part of the formal negotiations. We had access to what's called the blue zone at COP. Usually I would say there are 4 zones. There's where the core negotiations happen. There's the blue zone, which I'll describe in a moment, the green zone, and then there are some activities that happen outside in the same city as COP, but where the public can come. In the green zone and the blue zone, that's where you hear the numbers of the tens of thousands of stakeholders coming from all different sectors of society, many countries, and also some organizations, some industry organizations, some companies pay for pavilions, they're called. They're really kind of like small booths that have seating for about 20 people. And each of those pavilions hosts quite a bit of programming throughout the 2 weeks of COP. The blue zone is the more exclusive, harder to get access. You need badges to go in the blue zone. The green zone is a bit more open, but frankly, what's happening between the blue zone and the green zone is quite similar. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of panels and events and discussions that cover so many dimensions of climate action. I'll maybe speak from my own experience. I was on many panels that including several that we actually co-organized, that looked at the particular challenges of financing climate action in emerging markets, or the particular challenges of transition finance, defining and financing the transition. I was on many panels looking at critical minerals because it's been an area, mining and extractives, and their role in sustainable development has been a core expertise of mine for many years. So we presented work on innovation in critical mineral value chains that related to decarbonization and circularity in critical mineral value chains. I moderated sessions on hydrogen-based fuels for the shipping sector and their role in decarbonizing the shipping sector. So that just to give you a glimpse, but the number of topics in each of the pavilions are really vast. They can be quite interesting, actually, and I want to distinguish that a bit from some of the formal outcomes, because in some of those sessions, we were having actually interesting discussions about both some of the challenges, but also some of the solutions. On a session that we, with the climate school, organized with the UNFCCC and the UNFCCC's own pavilion, we had a pretty hard-hitting session on actually financing, on mobilizing the trillions, and why it's been so hard, and what the constraints were and how those constraints could be addressed. And in 1 hour with the former chief investment officer of the largest pension fund in Japan, one of the largest pension funds, if not the largest pension fund in the world, which is the Japanese pension fund. And we had representative from philanthropy and from the IMF. And we were really talking about what the real constraints were and how those constraints could be overcome in a quite constructive discussion. So that's what's happening in the blue zone and the green zone. Lots of conversations, meetings, panels, discussions, and dialogues. Sometimes the negotiators come out to the blue zone, but the formal negotiations happen separately. This COP, as you may know, was deemed the climate COP, the finance COP, because the main expected agenda of this COP was to come up with what's called, I think as Jeff said, the new Collective Quantified Goal, which was the new financing agreement from developed countries to finance climate action in developing countries. This was meant to replace the former commitment of $100 billion, which expires this year, and to set a new goal for the next 10 years. And the first goal took many years to even achieve. And then that's a whole other conversation about the terms of that finance and how climate finance is categorized, is counted, and so on. There are many open questions there, very little of which was addressed. I just wanted to touch on 3 of the formal outcomes from this year's COP, which all in some way relate to finance. The last one I will talk about is what the new collective quantified goal, but the 2 others were an agreement on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is the carbon markets, which I will talk about in one moment. And then the third kind of finance outcome was kind of the third step in operationalizing the loss and damage fund. So there was kind of some procedural steps. If you look at the UNFCCC's documents page, you'll see that there are a number of other statements and commitments, or mainly statements and outcomes that came out of this COP. But I think those 3 were the main substantive outcomes. What was not agreed at this year's COP, to major disappointment of many people, was any agreement on fossil fuels, on addressing the phase out of fossil fuels, largely over Saudi Arabia's objection to even mentioning the word or the term. But I think that's collective action problem at this point too, not only Saudi Arabia that's holding that back up, but that there was no outcome on that in this year's COP. So very briefly on Article 6, for those of you who are, but I'm going to ask Gernot to field any questions on this, because I'm a major skeptic of carbon markets. They're at this point, they're still quite small. In Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the idea is that countries can trade mitigation units among themselves, which in theory was meant to be a means of accelerating mitigation at the lowest cost. In practice, the way that it's implemented, which is largely through voluntary, unsupervised, unregulated emissions trading, it creates a lot of loopholes that at best are offsets. And I don't even think any of these emissions can really be offset for a variety of reasons, that even the concept of an offset is not exactly right, or not exactly right. It's just not right. And at worst, it allows for continued emissions by financing or trading in projects that actually have no mitigation impact. So the outcome, which was rushed through, the COP presidency was very eager to have something to show for Article 6. So it was announced on the first day of the COP, much to the chagrin of many people who thought the process was not appropriate. Agreed on frameworks for Article 6.2, which is bilateral, a framework for bilateral carbon emissions trading between governments, which remains with no oversight or supervisory role. In fact, I think the EDF wrote that the only way that that's going to be supervised is through civil society naming and shaming, which is a funny mechanism for oversight and enforcement. And then Article 6.4, which is the more global carbon credit market, which allows for private participants to participate as well. And the idea of these agreements was to formalize the market a bit more, to address how these emissions reductions are counted in countries' NDCs, and so on. Underwhelming, I think, a lot of criticism of the process, including some details, which for those of you who are interested could look into or we can address, including that kind of old retired emissions were allowed to be brought into this new trading mechanism. Again, lack of standards that are in any way meaningful. So a lot of criticism. I think the one silver lining that some people seemed happy with is there's a mechanism for Indigenous people's participation in some part of the marketplace, but in an overall system that is doomed to fail, that's a really small silver lining. So that's the carbon market, which I'm going to field all further questions to Gernot. But I will say one word about the collective goal, which, as Jeff said, I think was 300 billion. The commitment was to go up, quote unquote, from 100 billion, the pitiful 100 billion commitment, to a $300 billion per year commitment. But let me tell you what the agreement was not, and then what the agreement actually says. What the agreement was not was in any way a discussion of what needs to be financed and how we're going to finance climate action. In the same month, the high level, oh my gosh, the the high-level expert group on finance, I should know the name, the high-level expert group on climate finance, okay, I wasn't wrong, put out a report that is worth reading that estimated the actual costs of mitigation, adaptation, agriculture, loss and damage, and broke it down by developing countries outside of China, for developed countries, for the years between now and 2030, and then post 2030. Their estimates were, what were their estimates? That for developing countries outside of China, they estimated the cost for the clean energy transition is 1.6 trillion per year, 250 billion for adaptation and resilience, 250 billion for loss and damage, 300 billion per year for natural capital and sustainable agriculture, and 40 billion to support a just transition. And those costs go up after 2030, even with full investment now. And of course, that's a long report that looks at how those numbers are arrived at and how it should be financed. The COP agreement is 5 pages. It recognizes some of the extraordinary need. In Article 3, it recognizes at least that developing countries need 1.3 trillion per year, which is way less than what the high-level expert group acknowledges. And then it has an oratory, calls on all parties to work toward that 1.3 from all sources. But the only commitment from developed countries to developing countries is this 300 billion per year that is inclusive of all sources, public, private, and alternative sources of finance. So it's not even a commitment of $300 billion of public finance. It's $300 billion from developed countries to developing countries, inclusive of all types of finance. So it would include any leverage and through multilateral development banks and so on. So woefully small and inadequate. It led to a lot of disappointment. The India delegation in particular nearly walked out or had some quite strong, rightly deserved words for the inadequacy of the commitment. But there we are. And then there have been very, just on top of that, does not count for inflation, as the Guardian notes, although as one of the quotes in the Guardian article noted, that's like saying, that's talking about the couple of drops that weren't added in an empty cup. So that is the outcome. And the very last thing I will say is that one of the things that we discussed on our Columbia UNFCCC panel were the very real structural challenges and the structural barriers in the international financial architecture, especially for developing countries to access affordable finance. Those barriers are acknowledged in a few paragraphs in the 5-page commitment. It's recognized that developing countries face an extraordinary cost of capital. By the way, $300 billion commitment is not even committed to be at concessional rates or grants. It can come at market rate loans and so on. The challenges of access and affordability is recognized in the agreement, and the agreement just underscores the importance of solving those challenges without in any way suggesting how that would be done. So that's the agreement that we're left with. I'll turn it over to you, Lisa.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. This is on. Yes. Hi. Nice to see you all here. I'm Lisa Dale. I'm at the climate school, as I think was said. So my focus is on the adaptation side of the climate change policy two-pack of mitigation and adaptation. I focus on the adaptation side. And so my interest in COP this year, especially when it comes to the finance piece of this, was on whether the countries at the meeting would be able to come up with a quantified goal that would address the very dire needs of especially developing countries and vulnerable communities who are bearing the brunt of the risks from climate change, having had very little to do with emitting the greenhouse gases that are causing those impacts. So this is sort of the central challenge that we face at the COP. And just around what Lisa just revealed to us, I think the outcomes in that sense were uniformly disappointing. We had a new collective quantified goal amount that did not represent a consensus. This was not an amount that everybody felt good about. Many felt it was insufficient. There's certainly insufficient buy-in from wealthy countries that they are willing to and prepared to contribute at the scale that developing countries were asking for. Insufficient detail about the form those funds will take. Is it grants? Is it loans? If it's loans, we're looking at more debt. So that doesn't seem like a solution. It seems like delaying the problem. Insufficient detail about once those funds are donated and pledged, how are they allocated? No real detail on how accountability will happen, except as you say, naming and shaming, which kind of doesn't seem up for the task. And while we had some operationalization of the loss and damage fund, insufficient to really feel confident that this fund is in place, has the needed funds, and has a system for allocating that. None of that is really clear. So this was sort of the echoing call as we were leaving COP, and in the days after COP, we were there the first week, so this was sort of a few days later, a week later, that this sort of resounding disappointment was heard. But what I want to talk about here today is that even though this was tremendously disappointing, I don't think it was that surprising. And many also did not think it was that surprising. And why not? And I was asking myself that question. I came up with 7 reasons why these disappointing results are maybe not a surprise. And to jump to the conclusion, the spoiler alert is many people, myself included, are starting to think that we need to think about a different pathway entirely for addressing climate action, and especially the transfer of wealth and the transfer of funds, that maybe COP is not the place for that kind of discussion or problem to be solved. So let me go through my 7 reasons why I'm not surprised, and then I'll reiterate this conclusion that I think for me is helps me not feel hopeless, because I think it's a call to creativity and innovation, not just ending on a disappointment note. So here are the 7 reasons why many people were not surprised that we didn't reach a more robust financial outcome. Reason number 1, the idea of using COP as a vehicle for wealth transfer is relatively new. This is not what it was set up to do. This is a conference of the parties to a political agreement, a treaty. And the idea that movement of money and that climate action would cost money has always been part of the conversation, but in a smaller way. And the UNFCCC, in its founding years in 1992 and in the years since then, in nowhere in its documents is it understood to be primarily an institution for fostering wealth transfer. So the fit may be a bit clunky even at the outset. Reason number 2, we already have globally a flow of official development assistance funds that move money from wealthier countries to poorer countries to the tune of $223 billion in 2023. How this new money in the climate change context would interact with that existing flow of funds is not entirely clear, especially to countries that are being asked to donate and to contribute. Reason number 3, that I think some countries are reluctant to participate and to contribute. Even the wealthiest countries, I think we would be wise to remember, have themselves pockets of deep poverty and vulnerability. And the US is a perfect example of this. We are one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We are being called upon to contribute in large sums, and we have emitted greenhouse gases that are causing really dramatic damage around the world. However, here at home, we have coastal communities in need of support. We have climate adaptation needs here that far exceed our funding capacity or political will to fund and to succeed in solving those. So I include this reason also with a bit of an asterisk, which is to say, even in the absence of a global agreement on funding that we're all happy with, there's still room for countries to support domestic vulnerable communities and to create viable and important outcomes in their homelands. There's plenty of need there. Reason number 4, I think this was not surprising. Many countries see a contribution, especially in the loss and damage category, as an admission of liability. And here we are in the law school, right? And we know, certainly, even in the context of international law, which is nascent, not well developed in this area, countries would be understandably maybe reluctant to acknowledge liability in a legal sense or in an uncertain sense. What does this set them up for? Potentially mountains of lawsuits and ongoing claims for funds. I think that's part of some of the reluctance. Reason number 5. In some of the conversations that we hear at COP, and some of this is, I think, the part that I love the most, and maybe that Lisa referred to, outside of the negotiation rooms where everything else is happening, and 30,000 people or 70,000 people were at this event, and we see activists and advocates clamoring for better outcomes. And they're making arguments about reparations for colonialism, reparations for unjust practices around the world. And I think, and I know, for some of the country delegations, those claims fall outside of the scope of what the climate COP necessarily is about. And they may be valid, they may have merit, but they may exceed the bounds of what this treaty, the UNFCCC initially sought to create, and what countries maybe thought or hoped they were there to discuss and solve. And so there's an awkward fit in some of that. And I think I'm not surprised that it didn't perfectly land. Reason number 6, I'm not surprised. I think in many cases, the climate negotiators who are at the table as part of country delegations genuinely don't have the authority to allocate and obligate funds from their country. And if they had overpromised, right now we'd be hearing a cascade of parliament votes from around the world voting it down, right? Including here at home. So I think that's also part of the hesitation and the inability to line up authorities for finance with who's in the room at a COP. And then reason number 7 is maybe the most important and the starting point, which is, and I always say this to my students, so bear with me, there is no world government. We don't have a world government. We have a United Nations, which is a global institution designed to foster cooperation among sovereign states. Sovereign states are sovereign. And so it's not surprising that we have trouble with collective action. These sovereign states, 196 sovereign states, each with a very different perspective on their national interest and on their priorities. Those are my 7 reasons why I was not surprised that the outcomes were disappointing. They're not excuses, please don't misunderstand me, but they're understanding, and I think they're partly an explanation. And I really believe we have to understand what's not working if we want something to work. And so I think we are in a time of opportunity. Before we shift to the panel and hear some other perspectives, there's a lot of conversation now about rethinking sort of the framework, the institutional framework. And we're hearing this inside of COP and outside of COP on the global stage. The rise of populism is calling into question how durable our global institutional structure is. And I think this outcome feeds into that conversation as well in important ways. So I'm looking to my next generation here and hoping that we're limited only by creativity, by imagination, by our ability to think outside of the box. And all that said, I want to end on an even more positive note, which is to say, like Lisa Sachs, my experience at the COP was profoundly productive. And so the disappointing news coming out of the negotiating room is one piece of the story, but it's not the entire story. And there were bottomless connections, networks that were gained at this meeting. And those, I think, have tremendous value. They're harder to quantify, they're harder to point to, but I think they're tremendously valuable. So I'll stop there. Thanks. I guess it's me still. That, no. We're now going to move into a bit of a panel discussion. As you can see, we've been joined by 2 others here. So since you've already heard from me and you've already heard from Lisa Sachs, we're going to begin by asking our 2 panelists here to introduce themselves briefly, tell you briefly the first question to this panel. Introduce yourself, please. Tell us who you are, what your COP background and experience is, and whether you were at the COP this year and what your experience was like. Just situate yourself in this conversation. Amy Campbell, please, one of our students in Climate and Society.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Can you all hear me okay? Amazing. So yeah, I was a mitigation negotiator for the UK for a couple of years. So try not be too bleak and depressing about my reflections because I took a career break for a reason. But yeah, so I was a mitigation negotiator and I negotiated on something called response measures, which is essentially a fight about the costly implications of introducing climate policies. It tends to be quite dominated by Saudi and China and a lot of controversial discussions, and then the Just Transition Work Programme. So how we can kind of foster a just transition for workers. So yeah, I'm happy to talk a bit about my experience in the room and some reflections.
Thanks, Amy. Gernot.
Gernot, Wagner, Juggernaut without the jug. Actually, let me start with, I guess, the sort of most cynical of statements I can make, and then backtrack from there. So I've been to every COP since Copenhagen, through Dubai. I didn't go to Baku. And I guess to sort of put it as bluntly as I can, that might have been a step too far, even for, I believe I'm the carbon markets advocate here on the panel, which I'm not, but yes, economist, full disclosure. It's the sort of thing where actually everything that is happening around, right, the blue room, green badges, blue badges, and so on, is exactly, frankly, what these COPs are all about, right? And it's the sort of thing that if it didn't exist, somebody would have to invent it. And right, these conversations are crucial. Okay, well, I met most of these people at New York Climate Week, 2 months prior. It was all bikeable for me, at least. Everyone else seems to have been stuck in traffic for some reason, unable to figure out, how to walk 5 blocks. Yeah, sorry, cynicism. But okay, so in some sense, the question is, right, there's the actual formal negotiations, and that's a whole different bag of stuff. And that's important, right? And actually, Amy, you just mentioned it, right? So there's the, given that everything needs to happen by unanimity, more or less, right? 20 years in or so, it was never necessary for the Saudis to formally veto anything in the final text, because they could always hide behind somebody else. Well, by now, maybe a sign of progress, right? Everyone else, many others, have come around to some, if not all, of the least common denominator that comes out at the very end. And by now, it is, in fact, the Saudis who, right, not just veto the final line and the final day of negotiations for the summary of policymakers of the IPCC, a report, right? So we also politically negotiating the summary of the science, the one thing that anyone ever reads, but then also the COP text. And maybe, is this being recorded? Yes, right? Is there a recording somewhere? Yes. Okay, actually, okay, let me just say one more thing on this. So once you get invited by the Saudis, the Saudi pavilion, to join a panel on geoengineering, solar geoengineering, which I did. Maybe that's the step where you then say, sorry, I'd like to be part of that conversation, but maybe not under these circumstances. And yes, I hate to, right? So, greenwashing and all these sorts of things, but at some point, a lot of that, of course, is precisely that, for all the obvious reasons, because when push comes to shove, when actually money is at stake, right? Good thing we are talking about, not if, but when, and not if we should be spending what money, but how much and how, right? All of that is great. But maybe that is not the forum to do so, and maybe just very specifically, right? Article 6, 6.4, and so on, right? Okay, the good parts, for example, an agreement on day one, right, before the negotiations even started, 8%, 5 plus 3%, some distinction you can look up, it doesn't really matter at the end, but sort of 8% of the value of carbon credits being traded will be donated to an adaptation fund, which is great, right? Yes, and in some sense, that's the right order of magnitude. That's where the negotiations come in, right? Some want at 12%, some want at 0, 8 is a comp, fine, good, right? Can't be 100, 50 is too much. Okay, what's the percent? And at the same time, there's this agreement, so 2% of allowances being traded get retired every year. And right, so this is sort of markets 101, right? The fewer credits there are total, the more valuable they are, and at some point we need to get to zero emissions. So 2%, yes, full. Now it's 2%, right? It's not like 2 times 50, so in 50 years we are done. No, it'll never reach zero. But that's something, right? It's better than 0. Now, I guess here's my question to you, right? Okay, so here's my, my United app, United Airlines app, allows me to, and full disclosure, yes, I do fly. I didn't fly to Baku, but I, lots of, right? So I think it's $3.50. I don't need to pull it up. I think I know that by now. So every time I buy a ticket, they give me the opportunity, the option to donate $3.50 to the United Venture Fund invests money in sustainable aviation fuels. By the way, they put $150 million of their own money into it initially, which is, great, good, R&D, happening, important. Then they ask me to voluntarily do this. And I guess my question always is, why do they do it? Right? Not to make me feel bad about flying, to make me feel good about flying and do more of it. So in other words, maybe the grand conclusion of all of this, and back to COP, Article 6, 6.4, and so on, is yes, there are lots of questions about offsets, carbon credits, additionality, permanence, double counting. All of that is important. And there are some areas where the COP can be instrumental to figuring that out. Double counting, for example, is a key one, right? If you leave this up to individual companies, let the utility counts it towards their emissions goal, and the company buying electricity counts it to theirs as the scope 2 emissions, and then you add it all up and it's twice as much as the actual emissions reductions, and that's a problem, right? COP at the global level, figuring this out in Article 6 can solve some of that, could solve some of this. But the problem with offsets are not the offsets. The problem with offsets is the offsetter. It's the incentives it creates for the company that is now buying the offset and not investing in actually decarbonizing its own supply chain. And that goes at the very, very local level for the personal investments or local investments in. It goes at the global level. It's always been like this. It always will be like that. And that's the fundamental problem that needs to be solved. And that can't be solved by climate negotiators or climate negotiations in general. That is a much more direct question of, should we give credit, quotation marks, social credit, to a company that invests those $50 million in offsets and frankly does so as a marketing write-off? Right? That's why they do it. That's why United gives me the option to donate $350 to their venture fund, which is a for-profit fund, by the way, to donate my money to make me feel good about flying. And yes, at the same time, of course, United and Lufthansa et al. Are lobbying governments to not have international aviation emissions be part of the European Union emissions trading system, for example, the formal carbon market, right? Lufthansa gives me the chance to offset my emissions. Lufthansa is actually not lobbying the German government. That would be sort of a step too far. They're lobbying the US State Department to tell the Germans not to include aviation in its emissions trading system, international flights, right? Okay, so that was the cynicism in all of this. I can keep going, but frankly, yes, there are some hopeful messages too, of course, and 300 billion as the new 100 billion. Well, that's 3 times larger, right? That's good. Okay, just order of magnitude, $3.5 trillion spent on fossil fuel investments, infrastructure total, $1.5 trillion in foreign direct investment, if you just talk about international dimension, right? So if we are not figuring out how to channel those private investments in the right direction from the currently high carbon, low efficiency to a low carbon, high efficiency pathway, then what are we doing? Now, the definitively positive thing is what the COP does is creates a forum in many ways for announcements, ambitious announcements on that dimension too. And not just, private, also, well, the Indonesian president used the opportunity to announce a coal phase out, not down, for Indonesia within 15 years. Okay, will that happen? How? Who funds it? How is the Asian Development Bank's subsidy? How the subsidy is going to figure into making that happen and so on. The details are important. And that, of course, was not part of the 7-minute speech or so that made this announcement. What the COP did was create a forum. And that, again, if it didn't exist, somebody would have to invent that kind of forum to incentivize, to use a dirty economic term, but leaders to show up and make these announcements, demonstrate this ambition. Of course, it would be good to also have enforcement mechanisms that go beyond my former employer, EDF, talking about naming and shaming those who don't comply with the announcements.
So let me hear from maybe all three of you, and then we'll turn to our final speaker. What are your expectations, hopes, and fears for COP30 next year in Brazil? Maybe Lisa, can we start with you?
Yeah. There's a lot of anticipation for COP30. I think the anticipation for COP30 predated COP29. Actually, a lot of people were already looking ahead. Brazil has given indication that they are serious about their leadership in various challenges of global development. I think there's some hope. I think that there can be more serious discussions. I like, as Gernot said, or no, Lisa, sorry, you said, but I think that you're right that the venue provides other, fora for other types of announcements and collaborations. And I think that, again, the anticipation for COP30 has created space for that. So I think we can anticipate a lot of other public engagement and collective engagement. There's some controversies, political controversies about where it's being held in the Amazon and the practicalities, logistics, and what's being sacrificed there. Maybe the last thing I would say before handing it over is that in the financing side, there are other related parallel international conversations. There's the Financing for Development conference in June of this year, where there's another opportunity for the world to collectively come up with a new financing agenda. The BRICS are advancing reforms on financial architecture. G20 has been addressing finance. So I will just say, from a financing framework, we shouldn't wait to or look to COP30, but engage with these other processes in the meantime to address some of the continued challenges.
Yeah, so just briefly to incorporate some thoughts on COP29 and then some thoughts on COP30. So I agree that it was a deeply concerning outcome, but from being in the room, I would say that it was very much a result of the UNFCCC process and also climate diplomacy just fundamentally being stuck. And that's for 3 reasons. Firstly, heavily politicized dynamics. Secondly, process mismanagement. And thirdly, something called constructive ambiguity in negotiations. So firstly, with the dynamics, I don't know how many of you know about the Copenhagen COP, but it was kind of known as the disaster COP, and the 100 billion was plucked from nowhere. It wasn't needs-based. It caused a huge amount of mistrust between developed and developing countries. Many agree that it was never met. It was kind of met through creative carbon accounting and a lot of loans. And that wasn't unblocked at the expert or political level before COP29. And so there was incredibly challenging dynamics going into the conference. And I very much see COP as kind of the end point, right? Because you have the June negotiations, the Bonn sessionals, you have workshops in between. By COP, you should have really gotten ministerial sign-off, had experts agree, and then you push forward to the final text. Something called CBDR-RC, that's common but differentiated responsibilities and respect for capabilities, was weaponized. And you have this huge developing country toxicity, which means that you can't move as a negotiator, you can't get into the substance. So having been a mitigation negotiator, I wasn't allowed to talk about fossil fuels. If you talk about fossil fuels, you'll have all the lawyers pile in, red lines get crossed, everyone gets annoyed. So when you're at a point where you can't talk about mitigation in the mitigation room, you have to question whether the process is working. You have Saudi and the G77 in China blocking everything at any turn, and it's incredibly toxified. And then second, and relatedly, process mismanagement. The quantum came out so late in the game. The 250 billion was leaked by developed countries kind of midway through the second week. And what that meant is there was no negotiating leverage to actually up the quantum and to unblock it. And then it was lifted to 300 billion eventually, but we had walkouts from SIDS. Lisa mentioned the Indian negotiator. There was a hugely impassioned speech from Diego, the Bolivian negotiator. And the Azerbaijanis very much blundered the process. They use something called shuttle diplomacy, which is when you keep the text from negotiators, you develop it behind the scenes, and negotiators are just sitting there, unable to influence it. And then you have a deal or no deal at the very end. And then the argument is, well, some deal is better than no deal. And then finally, constructive ambiguity. This is kind of when a document wording is just about vague enough for each party to interpret according to their own national context and priorities, and it very much enabled the Paris Agreement to happen. For example, there was peak emissions as soon as possible in the Paris Agreement, and you can interpret that according to your own timeline and capabilities. But when it comes to a climate finance goal, you can't use constructive ambiguity to get your way around that. As Lisa mentioned, that is about your own country's red lines, and it's extremely political and divisive. So those are some reasons why COP29 went the way it did, but as some hope and some positives and looking forward to COP30. The roadmap to Belém, so it's called the roadmap from Baku to Belém, is a hook. And in negotiating terms, that means a kind of high-level, vague strategy that the UNFCCC is committed to, where countries have to report on it. And that roadmap is a 1.3 trillion hook. And yes, it's not clear that how we're going to get from 300 billion to 1.3 trillion, and there's a huge amount of mistrust. But in that text, it says lock in grants, concessional, and non-debt creating instruments and measures to create fiscal space. And that was pushed by Colombia, Kenya, Barbados, and Panama. And so my calling would be on civil society and academia and think tanks to use that roadmap to get what we need on adaptation finance. And then adaptation finance, we have not had an adaptation finance goal since COP26. COP26 was the only time that parties have ever agreed to a public finance goal. And as Lisa mentioned, that 300 billion is inclusive of everything. There is no hook or means of accountability for adaptation finance. And the UNEP adaptation gap finance report came out a few weeks ago. The gap is 387 billion. So we have an NCQG, which is 300 billion inclusive of public and private finance. And we have an adaptation finance gap of 387 billion. And we know that MDBs can scale up private finance. And there was progress on access to climate finance. There was 5 pages of the NCQG dedicated to access to climate finance. But looking forward to COP30, we have to use that roadmap to scale up that 300 billion to 1.3 trillion with accountability and making sure that you focus on adaptation finance.
Well, COPs are all about not adaptation, sorry. They should be, they're not. Sorry, let me start from, okay. Are all about expectations. Again, so like 20 years running or so, it has always been the same expectations game in many ways, which when played well, can be really productive. Right? The sort of thing that, frankly, builds up to, allows for this, right, positive, building on top of each other's ambition and essentially this one-upmanship among world leaders, private entities, and so on, in getting credit where credit is due and doing what would not have otherwise happened. Were just for domestic politics. Frankly, I have a very hard time seeing how much of that would help at this point on the mitigation front, the mitigation side of things, in the sense that I'm much more worried about what the head of the project finance division at Citi is now going to do, or at HSBC, or at wherever, is going to do in light of apparently no more coal plants being built in Indonesia and 100 of them being phased out within 15 years, right? Who finances the alternative and how, and does so profitably, and so on. And how do you break the contracts? 90% of global coal power is locked into contracts of 20 plus years, plenty of them in Indonesia as well. How do you do that in light of the apparent political ambition to do something about phasing out, right? That's mitigation. And most of that, hopefully, will happen anywhere other than COP30, long before COP30, maybe New York Climate Week, which is not that long before COP30, but yes, there are plenty of other fora for that. On the adaptation front, that's an entirely different, right? Adaptation, not exclusively, but yes, is in the purview of governments, taxpayers, funded subsidies, foreign aid, the sort of transfers of money public funds without an expectation of, returns, right? Yes, returns in the social broader sense, but not immediate investment payoff. You only do what pays 8% return or whatever that you need for your energy infrastructure investment. That's where I think COPs are crucial. Ought to be the big thing, where many more of those adaptation conversations, on the one hand, formal and informal, and also announcement and real money changing hand happens. But again, I'd be much more worried what the head of project finance at HSBC is up to these days. And frankly, how to turn climate finance into just plain old finance and stop talking about, right, creative instruments and so on, and, make it boring and replicable.
I think with that note, we're ready for our keynote speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Sachs. Are you gonna?
I'll speak from here.
Oh, okay.
Really?
Yeah, why not?
No.
Okay.
Come up here. Yes.
This is why you put the daughter.
I was gonna say, I think I had family.
I'm sitting here.
Sitting in front of my name. Hi, everybody. Well, an excellent discussion. Let me take it from a different point of view, though. What are we trying to accomplish? And what do we need to do to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish? So broadly speaking, we know we have three buckets of aims. We have the decarbonization or mitigation objective. We have the adaptation objective, and we have the losses and damages objective. The difference of the latter two is adaptation is longer term investment in landscape and infrastructure to address long-term changes, and losses and damages is preparation, anticipation, and response to crises. All three of these areas need significant financing. We know of trillions of dollars of financing of the energy sector, substantial investments for physical infrastructure that needs to be made resilient, especially water crises of multiple sorts that will come with climate change. And we know that the losses and damages are hundreds of billions of dollars per year ahead, and a lot of that in very poor places. So there are several different aspects to consider for those three categories. One is the incentives for governments and the capacity of governments to actually carry out the kinds of investments that need to be made. The second is the nature of the financing of those investments. And the third is the considerations of equity and distribution of burdens that result from all of this. That's we need for any kind of solution, at least these categorizations and this understanding. And each of these raises many complicated questions. So let me start with the mitigation issue, because it's in a way the most straightforward. This is investing in energy, which every country in the world does, and usually it's a mix of public and private investments in a highly regulated system, because the power system and more generally the energy system does not fit the criteria of market competition. There are all sorts of natural monopolies that are part of this, the long distance transmission grid. There are land use issues, liability issues, systems resilience issues. So we end up with public utilities rather than private companies, though we could have independent power producers being part of the generation process. In other words, a power system is a complex system. And if you go beyond the power system to other aspects of the energy system, pipelines to carry hydrogen or industrial ecology issues or building codes and land use issues. This is of course, a morass that does not look like a market economy in any economy, though it has aspects of a market. So inevitably, we're talking about a complicated investment process with both public and private actors. We're also talking about a very fundamental issue, which is part of the COP process, and that is that rich countries face a financing environment completely different from poor countries. And this is partly a mystery to economists that study this for decades, and partly a bit understandable. But the basic fact is this: high-income countries generally have creditworthiness, meaning that their credit ratings are investment grade. About half of the upper income countries and a larger proportion of the GDP of upper income countries is investment grade. For lower middle income countries, it's actually right now 2 of the 56 lower income countries that have investment grade credit ratings, just India and the Philippines. And for the 26 low income countries in the world, there's not one that has an investment grade credit rating. So even if these countries have governments determined to do things, they can't. They cannot raise the financing at terms which then are repayable on the current functioning of the international financial markets. Why this is, by the way, is not completely straightforward. In fact, to my mind, it's really messed up. And since I've been in international finance economics now for 44 years, not counting my dissertation work, another few years, this puzzle remains for me. It was the central puzzle when I started in international finance, and it remains a puzzle today. Low-income countries often have very good growth prospects. So why can't they borrow? A famous paper by one of our Nobel laureates, Robert Lucas, asked, why doesn't capital flow to poor countries? And he gave some answers which are interesting, but hardly definitive. And this is not a solved problem. So the climate crisis comes into a bigger puzzle, which is that poor countries have a difficult time in this world, period. And I have said for decades that many of them are effectively in a poverty trap, which makes it very hard for them to get out of this mess without concerted action of various kinds. So even on the mitigation side, which is the quote unquote easiest part of this issue from a purely technical point of view, and easiest from a financing point of view for the reason that you're investing in something that has a return, a market return. You're investing in power generation, and then there's a power tariff, and that pays back the loan in principle. And you can calculate based on the interest rate what the cost per kilowatt hour should be in order to pay, and that's called the levelized cost of electricity. The problem is if you're paying non-creditworthy rates, the cost of electricity is so high, there's not going to be electricity because there won't be a demand in low-income settings for that electricity. And that violates both our normative commitments globally that people should have electricity, and it violates the principle that all of the climate action should be under the framework of sustainable development, which means it's not to trap countries in poverty with responsibilities that they can't fulfill. And that's part of the preamble, but also part of the ethos and the legal structure of all of this. So on mitigation, the United States does not have a financing problem for mitigation. it's got a political problem. It's got a Donald Trump problem. It's got a Joe Manchin problem. It's got a corruption problem. It's got a lot of, I can't even say it in polite company problem, but it does not have a financing problem. It can borrow. Everything that needs to be done can be financed. It can even be financed under the institutional structure that we have, because the cost of capital is not so high. The cost of renewables is not so high. This is intentionality in some sense, whether the United States ends up doing what should be done or not, but not a financing issue. And that's basically true of 50% of world GDP or so currently, maybe even 75% of world GDP, but it's only true of about 20% of the world population, because the rest are poor. They don't count for GDP, but they count as human beings, and they count for global development and sustainable development. And we haven't solved the problems for the poor people. Now that's on mitigation. On adaptation, two fundamental issues are raised that are completely different from the mitigation issue, and they've been mentioned. One is most adaptation investment does not have a financial flow attached to it. So you borrow, but you have to repay out of general revenues of government, not out of the specific returns of that investment. And that makes things harder in general for financing. It's a general, and most of the adaptation is not by private entities, although some is. You weatherproof your house in a different way. You may do things as an individual investor to protect yourself. But the kinds of adaptation funding that we're talking about at the COP generally are large public goods kinds of investments that do not have a return to them automatically. So they already involve a pretty complicated fiscal framework that is needed. But then consider that poor countries can't finance that under any event because they're not creditworthy. So they can't borrow at 12% interest to finance an adaptation project. That's one issue with adaptation that's different. The other issue with adaptation, in my view, is that it raises the justice issue in a completely different way from mitigation. Nobody has the right to emit CO2, in my view, from an ethical point of view. And that means that every country in principle has the responsibility to invest in clean energy rather than dirty energy, period. But when it comes to adaptation, that is like a public nuisance or a tort that has been committed by those who don't emit CO2 by those who have emitted the CO2. So this is really more like a case of tortious interference or malfeasance or public nuisance, technically, that's involved here. If we were talking about a normal legal framework, we would say somebody's caused damage, somebody is incurring costs because of that damage. That's what adaptation is. If there weren't human-induced climate change, you wouldn't have to invest in the adaptation. It's a waste of money, the true adaptation cost, except that you have to do it because somebody's wrecked the climate. If you're the one that's wrecked the climate, it's your own fault and you should pay for it. But if you're very poor and you haven't done anything to the climate, but the climate's doing something to you, then in principle, somebody else, those who did the harm should pay. So this is, to my mind, very different from the mitigation issue. With mitigation, it is how do you finance an energy sector? With adaptation, the intrinsic question of who should pay is, in my view, central, not incidental. You could say with mitigation, well, there's also a problem who should pay because poor people need help. But with adaptation, it's literally who should pay because somebody's done a damage and somebody's incurred a cost. And I generally believe that this is like a tort, that whoever has committed the the offense that has led to the cost owes compensation to those who are incurring the cost. When it comes to loss and damage, of course, it's even more obvious and direct. But I think what applies to loss and damage also applies to adaptation. These are extra expenses that you would not bear except for the global climate change. When it comes to mitigation, of course you would bear them. You want an energy system, and you don't have the right to have an energy system that damages other people's environment anyway. And so you pay the cost of an energy system. So I don't see the justice side in that sense. I see the practical side. How are we going to actually get this investment done? Okay, so these are the issues. One more point that is important. All of this is on a time horizon of investment that is 25 or 30 years long. In other words, if you're going to decarbonize the energy system, it's not something you're going to do this year. It's something you're going to do in a process that's going to last to mid-century, roughly. And that's why we even say mid-century is the goal. You have to roll off old infrastructure. You're going to invest in new infrastructure, and it's going to take 25 or 30 years to get this done. In rare cases, you'll scrap some things early, but not so much, because that's really expensive to do. And it's not justified to shut down, to take all the cars and smash them today, although we've had stupid policies like that once in a while, actually to literally trash our cars and then have people buy cars with higher mileage standards. But we have crazy politics. But in any event, this is a process of 25 or 30 years. First, that's outside of the planning horizon of almost any government. This is one basic point. And second, it means that all the commitment issues and how to get a collective action and monitoring and so forth is also quite difficult. The solution that was taken, that every 5 years countries would make improved offers in their nationally determined contributions, is just simply awful. It's wrong in every possible way. It was done because it was the way you could get an agreement in Paris in December 2015. To my mind, it makes no sense, but it was written by politicians for politicians. So they wanted to make a statement about what they would do in the next 5 to 10 years. I put in, or I was instrumental in putting in one sentence in the Paris Agreement, Article 4.19, which says that countries should also submit long-term low-emission development strategies. And to my mind, that's all they should do. I find the NDCs completely a waste of time and the wrong way to think about the problem. And so I want countries to have a 30-year plan to say, how do we get to zero? Not how do we go from coal to gas and therefore lock ourselves in for the next 30 years, but how do we go from coal to solar or to nuclear or to something else to actually get down to zero? And you can't do that in a short-term plan. You need a long-term plan. Final point on that kind of planning. Much of this needs to be done not at the country level, but at the regional level, because most countries do not have their own power system. They are connected with their neighborhoods. Think of Europe, think of Southeast Asia, any place in the world. Transmission lines go across national boundaries, and with renewables, they surely should, because you have pockets of wonderful solar or high wind or hydropower that you want to connect to population centers, and you want the balancing of intermittency. So you want a connected large geographic grid. So this should be done at a regional level. Okay, so this is the question. Countries, governments need to make complex plans. These plans are not straightforward. They are well beyond political horizons of the specific governments. They're technically beyond the capacity of most governments to actually carry out. They need to be financed on a large scale. The financing only works, by the way, if the interest rates are sufficiently low, because if interest rates are high, one basic point to understand is that fossil fuels become much more attractive than renewables at high interest rates, because renewables, even if they're at grid parity at a normal interest rate, at a high interest rate are much more advantageous. That fossil fuels are much more advantageous because with fossil fuels, you pay as you go, whereas with renewables, it's capital intensive. You pay the interest rate, basically. So if the cost of capital is determined by the interest rate, whereas with fossil fuels, it's determined by the price of oil, gas, or coal. And the implication of that is we really need to get the cost of capital down for the non-creditworthy countries to be able to offer a practical solution. Okay, now, of course, none of this is happening at the COPs. None of it. And one can then ask a number of questions. Well, is the COP the wrong place? And the answer is no, it's the only place we have, but we need the process to be different from the process that we have. There is no other source of international law, treaty, or ability to actually carry out these negotiations in anything like a comprehensive manner for a truly global problem. So the COP, to my mind, is the only place to do this. But the process is not designed for this at all. What is it designed for? It's a very interesting question. It is really designed to do nothing, it seems to me, right now. So it is designed to suit the United States first and foremost, which is let's have the US not leave. We are the most ornery country in the whole world. We're the richest, we have the biggest historical responsibility, and to use a technical term, we're the most pig-headed of all the countries. And by that, I mean, we can't even admit to any responsibility. We can't even admit to any financing obligations. We can't even admit to a national plan. We have no national plan. We have some tax credits in IRA, but we have no national plan. And you couldn't pass a plan in Congress because it's Congress. That means that it's paid for by the fossil fuel industry in about 30 of the states. So unfortunately, the international process mimics the United States. The truth is, it fairly much suits the purpose of all the fossil fuel producing world. So what's happening basically is the fossil fuel producing world isn't so much interested in all of this, especially the net exporting fossil fuel world, but even the net importing fossil fuel producing world. And it's the US, Canada, Australia, Russia, the Gulf countries, which together are about 75% of each of the fossil fuels. For coal, it's 85% in the top 10. For gas and oil, it's 73% is the top 10 production. None of them has any, if I could call it, burning interest in solving this problem. They have a pretty strong practical interest in continuing to sell their commodities, and that's basically, they hold back, hang back, and don't actually aim for any practical solutions. When Hillary Clinton raised $100 billion in Copenhagen in 2009, as a kind of offhand remark, by the way, Ban Ki-moon established a working group to determine what to do about that. And when I asked one of the participants in the working group around 2011, how's it going? They said, well, there is a particular US individual, I won't name names for the moment, except to say that person's role is to make sure we never talk about a single number in this group. And they went on for 3 years and didn't speak about a single number because the United States does not want to talk about financing. And there never was in 11 years one spreadsheet that said, here's how the 100 billion could be distributed. It wasn't even defined properly. What is the 100 billion? What counts? What doesn't count? It was a game all the way through 2020. And now it's a game now what the 300 billion is. If you actually read the text, it is completely unintelligible what they agreed. And believe me, the diplomats know it's unintelligible. Even the 300 billion, it says from public and private sources. So what is it? What's going to count? What doesn't count? Doesn't matter. It's a game. That's for 2035. Okay. So what to do? I don't know. I really don't know. I've been thinking about this for 44 years, and I don't know what to do exactly. Lisa's right, but not, I don't agree completely. First, I think this is the venue, as awful as it is, where this has to be done, because I don't know of any other. Second, we need global government, and we don't really have it. And we should all understand one thing about this global government business. We have governments at several different levels, and we're all governed at many different levels. So I am governed by UN treaties, and I'm governed by the North American free trade area, though Trump is about to rip it up. But that's a treaty and US law. And I'm governed by the federal government, and I'm governed by New York State, and I'm governed by New York City, and even what's our local community?
District.
What is it?
One of our districts.
Yeah, what's community?
Borough.
6? No,
Yeah.
and then Manhattan, and then
Yeah,
what?
District 6.
District 6, okay. So, all right, all these governments, and they send me bills too, by the way. That's fine. So when we say global government, in the US, you're trained to shudder at that. Oh God, no, we'll have a global dictatorship. This is not the right way to understand government. The right way to understand government is that you have collective action problems at many different levels, and therefore you solve collective action problems at many different levels, and you have enforcement at many different levels. So we need a global level for certain problems, not for everything, but for the oceans and the atmosphere, yes. And for nuclear proliferation, thank you, yes. And for a few other things, yes. Not for the school where my granddaughters go. We don't need a global government for that. I don't want the UN to run that. Okay, so we need to make sure that that global level works, and it doesn't. And we've been trying global government now for 103 years since the foundation of the League of Nations in 1921. That one went kablooey in 1939. And now we're in the second effort with the UN, which will have its 80th birthday next year. We've got to make it work. So for the law students and the diplomatic students and the CEPA students and the economists and everybody else in the room, the homework is how to make that work. Not to be cynical, not cynical. We have no other choice but figure out how to make this work. And it's not one problem, it's several problems that I've mentioned. But especially how to get financing to poor countries, and how to have some fairness in this system also. Those are the two big issues. And then how to get governments to have the competency and the time horizon to actually do the things that they need. It's not so, I'm going to stop here. It's not so hard for a few reasons. First, 15 countries or so account for the vast majority of all the problems and the potential solutions. The rest are waiting for the solutions, but the big countries have the greatest responsibility, historical, practical, current, emissions, GDP, everything. Just China and the US, if they ever sat down and talked to each other seriously, not in a photo op, but what are we going to do? Roll up the sleeves. Let's figure this out. That would be half the world's problem solved. And so it's not so hard. At the end, you have 193 countries around the table, fine, but that's not where the real negotiating needs to take place. That's where you stamp a globally legitimate solution at the end. But the negotiations can be among a much smaller group of countries. So I don't think that this is so hard. One idea that this is my last point that last sentence. Global government should include global taxes. What our Congress hates the most of all, it hates two things. It hates taxes because the donors don't like taxes. But the worst possible thing for an American congressman is taxes that go to some poor person someplace else. God, they hate that. Why would we ever do that? Our whole country is based on the proposition, get out of my face. I don't need to help you.
That can't be your last sentence.
That-
You need another last
Right.
sentence.
So I want to take our Congress out of its misery and have global taxes that have nothing to do with the US Congress. I want to tax global shipping, global aviation, CO2 emissions, foreign exchange transactions, and have the money go straight to the UNFCCC for its adaptation fund, for its mitigation risk reduction fund, for its losses and damage fund, and so forth, and just obviate all the rest. If we had a global parliament, we should just do that, period. We don't. We have a nation state problem. But I want to have that problem one time, and then for the next 50 years, leave our Congress people alone, please. Don't bother them about this. They don't have to vote anything about this. We'll have a system that works without them. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay. Hi. Okay, the good news, bad news and good news. Bad news is we don't have time for question and answers. We need to very, very quickly we need to very, very, very quickly leave the room because there's a class starting imminently. But please, if you have questions, which I hope you do, email me. I'd like to collect them. lisa.sachs@columbia.edu. That's lisa.sachs@columbia.edu. And we'll host a sequel. We'll follow up. We'll get the answers because this will be an ongoing discussion. So thank you. And please leave quickly so that the other students can come in. Thank you.